Everyone knows this is the first week we have of our Grand Round series is in the category of physician wellness. And we do this, is a very important topic. Grand Rounds, is for all third and fourth years, but as well for affiliated residencies and fellowship programs. Prepare them. And the topic of physician wellness is broad. It also includes areas like financial wellness, which is honestly a topic today, which is, very important. So we're going through it. We've had a partnership with Lending Hearts, and Lending Hearts is an organization, and Vaso Flores is there, the founder, executive director. And this is a group that works on behalf of children and, young adults, as well as their families living with cancer, multiple programs, events, and classes that developed in providing things like social, emotional, physical well-being during treatment and beyond. And this is also where we're developing a club here with LECOM, and we're very fortunate because we have one of our key alumni, Dr. James has also been one of the huge proponents of that, and he's one of the leaders in radiation oncology at AHN, and so he is working with us on that. But they have brought us some, their partnership with us, physician wellness. So they'll be throughout the year helping us with that. And today we're excited bringing in Lacey Thurner, and is a planning specialist. And she works for the Senior Wealth Strategy Association. And she has a presentation just on personal finance, preparing for the future, finances of student loans. We think this is a very important topic. And wellness, because you're always worried about finance in the back of your head, and a lot of us aren't well trained here. So it's great having some added expertise. So without further ado, I turn it over and thank our presenter for today.
Thanks so much, Michael. And thanks to LECOM and, of course, Lending Hearts for having me. If you can hear me okay, can you nod for me, Michael and Vaso? All right, perfect. I think everyone is muted on the call until about the last 15 minutes for some questions. So please, if you got questions, write them down throughout, and I'm happy to address them at the end. And you can always feel free to shoot me an email after the fact as well. But as Michael mentioned, my name is Lacey Thurner. I'm a planning specialist with UBS Financial Services. In my role with UBS, I'm working with individuals, families, small business owners to develop a suitable investment strategy and develop financial plans to help them achieve their various financial goals. And that ranges from retirement planning to investment management, debt management, charitable giving, tax efficient planning, estate planning, you name it. We've dealt with clients from all walks of life across all different facets of the financial world. So not too many situations we haven't come across or seen in what I do. And hopefully I'll be able to pass along some of the helpful tips and knowledge to you today. So on that note, the goal of today's presentation, and this has been as a result of you guys kind of requesting this, is to give you some general education on investments, savings and budgeting, and a little bit about just some general helpful tips for managing your financial life. And I know, especially when you're in residency and you're working hard and you may not be earning the biggest of incomes yet, but soon to come, it can be a little difficult. You've got limited income to work with and potentially sizable loans to help. You've got to fend off, right? So we'll talk a little bit about each of those things. And hopefully you'll feel a little less intimidated about approaching some of these financial decisions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen. We'll have the presentation up here for all of you to view, and we'll go through it. Bear with me 1 second here. Okay. And can you nod if you can see that? All right, perfect. So I'm going to flip over to the first slide. And what I want to start with is talking about 3 of the most common financial needs of investors under the age of 40. Now, if you're over the age of 40, that doesn't mean that these won't apply to you, but you may have some additional complexities. You're a little closer to retirement. If you're under the age of 40, these are the 3 most common from a recent survey that we've done. The first is being able to retire comfortably and at a reasonable age. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're saving sufficient capital, and we'll talk a little bit about how much that should be in order to be able to reach that goal. It can be really important that you start this early, right? Because if we wait until, let's say, we're age 45 and our target goal to retire is 55 or 60, probably not going to have much luck with that being able to maintain our same lifestyle. So we really want to start saving early and often. I also always like to point out whenever you're trying to allocate your excess savings and determine, where do I really want to save this capital into? Maybe you're trying to juggle a couple different goals, like saving for a home, or you're saving for a child's college education or debt payoff, whatever it may be. You don't want to cheat yourself from saving for retirement. Because when it comes to retirement, you can't take out a loan for that, right? You can take out a loan for college education. You can take out loans for buying a new home, but you can't take out a loan for retirement. So keep that in mind. And we'll talk about some different retirement vehicles that you can utilize to help save for that goal. The second goal is maintaining an emergency fund. So this is basically just a rainy day fund, making sure you're setting aside sufficient cash that can be used for any unanticipated events. So think of things like, you lose your job, your significant other loses your job, you've got a house issue, car issue. We want to make sure we have enough cash set aside to cover those types of events. So we're not racking up credit card bills and incurring, major financial deficits or missing bills entirely. That can really hurt our financial situation. And we'll talk about some savings vehicles we can use for that as well to help you generate some interest. And then the third goal is budgeting for your expenses. So this can be difficult when you have limited income to work with, but it becomes extremely important because you want to make sure that you're deploying that income as efficiently as possible. The same is true if you have sizable debt levels. You want to make sure you're being as efficient as possible with aggressively paying that debt down. So we'll talk about developing a budget, and we'll also talk about a rule called the 50-30-20 rule that can help you to approach that. So lots to get to today, so I'll flip forward from there. A good way to approach tackling some of these goals is to separate things out into buckets. So I like to look at this in the today bucket, the tomorrow bucket, and the beyond bucket. Today are going to be the things that you need right now. So this is capital you need to maintain your existing lifestyle and just meet your day-to-day needs. It also encompasses saving for emergencies. So that emergency fund that I just mentioned on the last slide. Your tomorrow bucket, these are usually going to be savings that are maybe 4 years to maybe even a decade or so away, things that we're trying to plan for in that regard. So it could be maybe we're saving for the down payment on a home, we're trying to aggressively pay down debt. And usually if we're saving for a big purchase, like a new home or a new car or something like that, we're going to need to have a solid credit score because we're going to need some type of a loan. So we'll talk about ways to build your credit score, things that impact your credit score, and we'll also talk about a couple debt pay down methods you can utilize. And then lastly, there's the beyond goal. So this is saving for retirement. So anything that's 15 to 20 years out, we want to make sure we have a solid plan in place for that. And we'll discuss some different investment vehicles to use as well. So let's start with analyzing and developing your budget. This slide here is showing you what a 50-30-20 rule would look like, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a moment. But I want to start with that budget piece. And, oftentimes when I'm having conversations with clients and I ask them, do you maintain a budget? I usually kind of get those glazed over eyes, guilt-ridden faces, no, I don't have a budget, and people feel guilty about it. But frankly, it's often a neglected task. There are very few people I ask if they have a budget that answer me with a yes. Okay. But it can be really, really important, and it helps you to hold yourself accountable. And it also can be pretty eye-opening. So if you take a look at your budget, you might notice $6.50 a day Starbucks run. That can add up really quickly. Maybe it's 50 streaming subscriptions, despite the fact that you watch the same 2 shows on Netflix every week. Again, really can weigh on your budget. And that money could be money you're using instead to aggressively pay down debt or savings. So I highly suggest putting a budget together. To do that, you'd want to take a look at your after-tax pay. So look at your pay stub. What's your take-home income? And I typically suggest looking at that on a monthly basis. So if you get paid bi-weekly, look at what your monthly take-home pay is over those 2 pay periods. I would say look at about the last 3 months as well, if there's any variability in your pay to get an average. And I would do the same for your expenses. So you're going to want to write down what your after-tax income is. And then you're also going to want to write down what your expenses are. And you'll separate that into 2 buckets. You're going to have your fixed expenses, which are your needs, right? These are the things you absolutely have to pay for. And then you're going to have your variable expenses, your discretionary expenses. So these are your wants, things you don't necessarily need, but you'd like to maintain them. Back those expenses out of that after-tax income figure, and that's going to give you a number. That number could either be positive or negative. If that number is positive, we've got some money that we could allocate to additional savings or more aggressive debt pay down, depending on your situation. If that number is negative, we're living above our means. And that means we need to take a deeper dive into our budget. It's as simple as that, right? So you take a look at your variable discretionary expenses to start. Look there and see, is it that Starbucks run? Are there things that you're spending money on unnecessarily that you could skinny down? If you do that and you end up with a positive number now at the end of that calculation, you're in good shape. Now you can start to further build that savings and pay down that debt. If instead you see a continued negative number, you've got to take a deeper dive into the fixed expenses. What's weighing on you there? Is it maybe rent that's too high? Could you find a roommate? Could you rent elsewhere? Are there other fixed expenses you can find a way to mitigate? Maybe it's increasing your income or finding a way to get a second income source to make sure that that number becomes positive. And if worse comes to worse and you're still seeing a negative figure, at an absolute minimum, try to keep credit card bills as low as possible and pay that minimum balance. Okay, so we don't want to see credit cards racking up. I have a really solid budget sheet that I'm happy to share with anybody after the conversation today. So if you're interested in that, just email me after the fact and I'll definitely send that over to you. It can be easy to get started with that. But to reference this slide, again, you've got the 50-30-20 rule here. And this is a really good way to break down your take-home pay. So about 50% of your take-home should be going toward your needs, about 30% going toward your wants, and about 20% to your savings and debt. So to give you an example of what that may look like, this slide is showing you a take-home pay of about $6,000, broken down between your needs, so rent, utilities, groceries, personal care, car payments, your wants, dining and entertainment, gym memberships, things we don't necessarily need, and your goals. And this is just about a 50-30-20 breakdown. Not perfect, but very close. So you could set it up this way, and that should be able to help you kind of segment out that planning. And one thing I want to note here is, when you're in residency or in college and your income is lower, you may go from making a very modest salary, 30 to 70 grand a year, to a major uptick well into the six figures. That can feel incredible. And especially after you've had to have that tightened belt for so long, you want to just kind of live your life and splurge. But it's really important that even as your income starts to increase, that you're focused on your financial goals and you're still living below your means. You want to make sure you're leaving sufficient excess to cover any debts that maybe you were getting behind on when your income was lower. Now you can become more aggressive with that pay down, especially if it's high interest rate debt. You want to get rid of that as soon as possible. You can get more aggressive with your savings, start further building on the savings that you're putting away for future goals, be that a home purchase or your retirement. And one thing we'll talk about later on today is the power of compounding. And that's the earlier that you can start saving, the better. And I'll explain what the power of compounding means when we get to that point. But again, the earlier, the better. So if you're able to find any room in your budget to free up for savings or debt pay down, it's going to benefit you in the long run. So also within that today bucket, outside of creating a budget, is saving for emergencies. So we want to make sure that, poor Fido here in this picture has a vet bill that comes up unanticipated. We don't want you to have to rack up credit card bills to be able to pay that. We want you to have that cash on hand to be able to pay that. So a couple tips in terms of creating that emergency reserve. First, you want to keep your checking and your savings separate from one another. You don't want to have those in the same bucket, and you don't want your savings account to be that easily accessible. So checking should be for cash inflow and out for your regular bills. Your savings should be segregated from that in a separate account. And there's some different savings vehicles that you can consider. I tend to refer to these as cash equivalents. They can help generate some interest on the cash that you set aside for emergencies. One option for that would be something called a high yield savings account. And kind of like the name entails, it offers a higher yield than a traditional savings account, so a little more interest. These often are FDIC insured, So what that means is that if for some reason the bank that you have that high yield savings account through were to go under, you would be protected up to the FDIC insured limit, which is usually 250 grand per account type per bank. So you definitely want to make sure you get that FDIC insurance. You're going to earn that higher interest rate. But one thing to be mindful of on the high yield savings accounts is that some of these do have restrictions in terms of the number of withdrawals that you can take out a month. Some have minimum balance requirements, minimum initial contribution amounts, maximum withdrawal amounts. So just be cognizant of what you're getting and shop around. There's a lot of different banks. UBS offers a high yield savings accounts. Lots of different ones do. So find that best interest rate. Some other options would be something like a certificate of deposit. So CDs are issued by banks. They also offer FDIC insurance up to those same limits typically. Again, you're going to earn interest on this holding, but some of these will have penalties if you sell prior to maturity. So you want to be careful of that. So sometimes it makes sense to ladder these things out. And what that would mean is maybe you buy a certificate of deposit that has a 3-month maturity. So it's a little shorter, maybe the interest isn't quite as robust, but then you look out at a 6-month maturity with a little more of your savings and a 9-month maturity. So you can start to layer those maturities so that capital is freed up for you. I would lean more on the side of the high yield savings account for your emergency reserve. But if you start to have a little excess in there, looking at things like a CD may make sense. And then treasury bills are another option. These don't have FDIC insurance, but they're backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, which we hope stays very solid, right? We typically have very good credit quality. So those usually have maturities under a year. You would essentially lend money out. They would agree to pay you back that full amount at the maturity of that T-bill, their treasury bill, plus some interest. Okay? So that can be another potential option for you. The next thing we need to determine once we've figured out what type of vehicle we're saving into for emergency reserve is how much we need to save. So if you are the sole income owner or sole income earner, within the household, you'll want to make sure you have at least 6 months to a year worth of expenses saved up. So I typically say, take a look at what your expenses are on average each month and make sure you have at least 3 or at least 6 months worth if you're the sole income earner. If you're in a dual income earning household, the rule of thumb is usually 3 months of expenses in your emergency reserve. If you want to be a little on the safer side, there's no harm in having 3 to 6 months as a dual income household or 6 to 12 in a single income household. You always want to make sure you pay yourself first. So what I mean by that is basically if you have some excess income, make sure that you're adding that to your savings. And if you can automate that, so instead of having to manually go in and move funds from your checking to your savings or wherever else, make sure that you just automate it. That way it's out of sight, out of mind. You're slowly building up that emergency reserve and it's happening without you even noticing the capital's gone. And lastly, start with small transfers and gradually increase them. What you don't want to do is start off overly aggressive with your savings, then realize it was over the top, you can't keep up with it, you lose confidence in it, you stop your savings, you don't get back into it, and that kind of derails your progress. So start out small, and as your income goes up, increase the amount you're allocating to that savings. So we covered the today bucket. So looking at creating our emergency reserve, developing our budget. Now let's look into tomorrow. So for your tomorrow type goals, we want to make sure that we have a solid credit score. Again, a credit score, your FICO credit score is something that many lenders, in fact, all lenders are going to look at before they lend you capital. And it's going to dictate also what the interest rate is that you get offered on that debt. So if we're looking to save up money to put a down payment on a house and we know that we're going to need a loan for the rest of the mortgage, we want to make sure our credit score is well established. And this can range from 300 to 850 for your credit score. Anything above 800 is considered excellent, but even 670 is still considered good. So we want to strive to get at least 670, hopefully higher than that. And some do's and don'ts on building up your credit score. So pretty intuitive, pay your bill on time, right? We want to make sure that we're always paying that bill on time, and at an absolute minimum, we're paying the minimum balance. If you can, pay off balances in full. A good rule of thumb that I've typically utilized has been utilizing a credit card that has some kind of perks. So either travel perks or extra points or cash back, utilizing that for the majority of my spending, which also helps so you don't have to worry about your debit and your checking account getting hacked. But you can use that credit card for the majority of your spending and then pay off that full balance each month. You're not accruing interest, but you're building a nice credit history, and you're earning the perks of that card. Some don'ts: we don't want to use more than 30% of your credit limit. So you don't want to exceed 30%. You don't want to apply for credit unnecessarily. So there's no reason that you need to have a retail credit card, despite them obviously arguing that you should. And regardless of what store you go into, they all want to give you their credit card. You don't need those. Every time your credit gets checked, it does ding your credit score. And you don't want to close old cards unless there's a fee attached to them. You want to keep that credit utilization open, even if you're not actively using that card. Don't close it out. And another tip is make sure you're checking your credit report at least once a year. You can do that for free at annualcreditreport.com, or there's a ton of different banks and different credit cards that offer that FICO credit score that you can pull any day of the week to double check on that for yourself. So what elements actually go into your credit score and what makes the biggest impact? 35% of your credit score is made up of your payment history. So this is the most important. It tracks if you've consistently made on-time payments and at least paid the minimum balance. 30% is what you owe in outstanding debt. So we, of course, want to keep that lower and below that 30% limit. 15% is your credit history. And that's basically just how long you've had credit accounts. The longer, the better. So establishing that credit early on is very good to do. 10% is going to come from new credit inquiries. So again, if you're attempting to open too many credit cards or you've got too many different loans outstanding, that can impact you. And then the last 10% is your credit mixture. So credit cards, installment loans like car payments, mortgages, other loans. It's not important you have one of each, but lenders do look at what the overall mixture is, and that does impact your credit score. And you always want to pay at least the minimum amount of your debts. That is my main takeaway of anything credit related. Make sure you're paying at least the minimum balance. And if you can, pay off credit cards in full. When it comes to student loans, we'll talk about some options for paying down that debt and 2 different options you can use for that, as well as this would apply for any debt. Another metric to look at that lenders are commonly focused on is your debt to income ratio. So we refer to this commonly as your DTI, and this is the ratio of your total monthly debt payments over your gross monthly income, your gross monthly income being pre-tax. So ideally, we want to make sure that our debt to income ratio is on the lower end. We want it to be at least 36% or lower. Okay, we don't want anything over and above that. So basically, if you take your total monthly debt payments, that includes student loans, mortgages, credit cards, divide it by your gross pre-tax monthly income, that's going to get you that percentage. And this is very, very commonly used by lenders to determine what interest rate they're going to lend to you for, and if they'll lend to you at all. So as you can see on the chart, 0 to 30% optimal, 31 to 36, we're in the safe zone. Start getting over 36, we're questionable, and at 43% up, we're in a risky zone. You're not going to get a good interest rate here if you get a loan at all. Okay. And I commonly get the question too, should I invest my money or should I pay off a debt more aggressively? And this is a really important question because it's all based around what's the interest rate on that debt. So if you come to me and say, I've got an 8% interest rate on a student loan, should I pay that off or should I save into an account? The odds of us being able to generate a rate of return on your investments above and beyond 8% consistently aren't that high unless we're taking a pretty sizable amount of risk. That said, we're probably better off to pay that loan off more aggressively as opposed to investing that capital. On the other hand, if you come to me and say, I've got a mortgage I got prior to 2021 at a 3% interest rate, and should I pay that off more aggressively or should I invest my money? I'm going to tell you to invest your money, because even with a safe asset like a treasury bill, like the cash equivalent we talked about, you might be able to get a 5% interest rate on that alone, taking very little risk, and pay yourself that 2% difference instead of paying that 3% loan off more aggressively. So there are instances where it actually makes sense to maintain some debt and it can be healthy for your financial situation. But high interest rate debt, we don't want any parts of that. So on that note, what are some methods we can use to pay down debt? I know student loans are a big one on this call, so you definitely want to tackle those as soon and as aggressively as possible. This first method, not my favorite, but it can be really good for building confidence to help you get out of debt if you're someone who gets motivated by small wins and it keeps you going with aggressive debt pay down. This is called the snowball method. So it basically means you're paying down debt based on the balance size of that debt. So the card or the loan that has the lowest balance is going to get paid first, then move on to the second lowest balance, and then so on and so forth. This could result in you having a higher interest burden, which is why it's not my preferred method. But sometimes we got to play head games with ourselves to stay in the game when it comes to finances. So if it motivates you to know, hey, I knocked out that one card or that one loan entirely, and now I'm able to move on to the next one, this can be a good strategy. What I prefer, though, is this method, the high interest rate method, where you pay down debt based on interest rates. Means you're paying the loan that has the highest interest rate first, then the second highest, then the lowest interest rate. Okay. This is going to alleviate the most interest burden for you. And what I highly suggest, this is what I did to get my student loans paid off. It's what I suggest to anybody. If you can stomach it and understand that sometimes your highest interest rate debt may also be your highest balance debt, we want to eliminate that interest as soon as possible. So we've talked about the today, we've talked about the tomorrow goals. Let's talk about the beyond, which is saving for retirement. Thanks to many people like you on this call, people are living longer and longer, right? We're living well into our 90s. We have a couple clients who are centenarians, and I would say more than a couple at this point, and those who are still well into their high 90s. So on that note, we want to make sure that we have sufficient capital saved so we can live a comfortable retirement. And we may spend more years in retirement than we do working. So it's really important that we start early and we save often to be able to meet that goal. And again, we'll talk about the power of compounding to get you there. We're going to talk about as well some employer retirement plans that you can utilize. And some other retirement vehicles we can utilize if you don't have access to a employer plan, or if you may have maxed that out and are looking for other options. Before we jump into those vehicles, though, let's talk about how much you'll actually need to save for retirement. So it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but a common rule of thumb is that we want to replace 80% of our pre-retirement income in order to retire comfortably. 80% of our pre-retirement income. For many of you on the call, that could end up being a substantial number down the line. A survey from AARP recently stated that $1.18 million would create about $40,000 a year in income for 30 years. Odds are, I'm going to guess that $40,000 a year in income is not going to be sufficient enough to cover 80% of what you need to replace your pre-retirement income. So that means we have a lot of savings to do, and we need to get that money working for us as soon as possible to get to your goals. Okay, and we can do that. Just takes some discipline and working through that budget to identify what excess we have to go toward that savings. So let's talk about a couple different account types we can utilize to save for retirement. Typically, it's not all employers, but many employers are going to offer something called a 401k plan, or commonly in the healthcare system, you're going to see this as a 403b. They're interchangeable. A for-profit organization typically issues a 401k. A nonprofit organization will issue a 403b. Very, very similar in terms of how they operate. So anything I say 401k, 403b applies as well. The employer may offer something called a matching contribution on money that you put into a 401k or 403b. So let's say you contribute 3% of your pay into a 401k and the employer offers a 3% match. That means you put 3% in, they're going to match 3%. That's a 100% return immediately just because you put 3% in. Never, ever pass that up. If you can, at least save up to the match on your employer plan. Okay, they're giving you free money. So that can be a really, really beneficial resource. So to give you a little insight on how a traditional 401k works, typically these are going to be funded with pre-tax dollars. What that means, money that you're earning in that year from your paycheck is going directly into that 401k without you paying tax on it. So it's reducing your taxable income for that year. Those assets then get invested into mutual funds that you select based on a limited investment menu that your employer provides to you. So you don't have as much flexibility here as you would in a different type of account. You're going to be stuck with the investment options within that plan. It isn't always a bad thing. A lot of them are very robust. So you invest that money into that account. It's typically going to be mutual funds. And all of the earnings are going to grow tax deferred for the lifetime that you have that capital in that 401k plan. What tax deferred growth means is that if you have securities that generate dividends, which are basically the distribution of profits from whatever company or fund you've invested in to you, that would typically be taxable income. If your security generates interest, that would usually be taxable income. And if you sell a position for more than what you bought it for, and you have what's called a realized gain, that would usually be taxable income in the year that it occurred. However, because you've got tax deferred growth, all of that's deferred off. You're not paying tax on any of those earnings during the time frame that you have those funds in that 401k. So fast forward, once you start withdrawing from that plan and taking distributions, any distribution you take will be taxable at your ordinary income tax rate. Okay, so the theory behind doing a pre-tax savings is that you're assuming your income tax rate is going to be higher now than what it would be come retirement. So you're deferring that income off, paying the tax at a later time frame. Okay, so that's a pre-tax 401k. The contribution limit for this type of account is $23,000 for 2024. And there's a catch-up contribution if you're over the age of 50 of $7,500. Those numbers increase each year, typically. So you will see those change over time as we progress. For a Roth 401k, this is going to operate very, very similarly to the traditional 401k, with the exception of some tax rules. So a Roth 401k isn't going to be funded with pre-tax dollars. It's funded with after-tax dollars. So when you earn that capital and you contribute it to the Roth 401k, you are paying tax on those earnings in that year, despite the fact that you're putting them into that Roth plan. But your earnings are going to grow essentially tax-free. So whenever you go to withdraw come retirement, you're not paying any tax on those distributions. So the theory here is that you may be in a lower tax bracket now than what you might be in retirement. So you'd rather pay that tax now than pay it down the line. Okay, and that tax-free compounding can be a huge benefit over time. Outside of that, Roth 401k can have matches from the employer as well. Those matches are usually going to be pre-tax, but there are some tax rules changing. They're kind of in the works as we speak that may allow for some Roth matching contributions as well. And not all employers offer Roth. That's a little more of a rarity, but becoming more and more common. Now, let's say you've fully funded a traditional or a Roth 401k, or you don't have that option through your employer. You can consider opening your own type of retirement account. So that could be like a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. These you could do through any kind of investment firm, and that's going to give you more of a broad array of investment options, right? Because you're not limited to that investment menu that's on your employer plan. You can buy individual stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, you name it. You can buy any of those positions, and we'll talk about each of those here shortly. So you've got a lot of flexibility there, but they do have a limited contribution amount. So as opposed to the 401k, where you can contribute $23,000, in a traditional IRA or Roth IRA, you can only contribute up to $7,000 for 2024, with a catch-up contribution if you're over the age of 50 of only $1,000. So much more limited in terms of how much you can save a year. And another thing to be mindful of with those types of accounts is they're subject to certain income phase-out limits. So as your income grows, you need to be cognizant that you may start to be phased out of being able to contribute to a deductible IRA or to do a direct contribution to a Roth IRA. And it gets phased out over your income. So it might be you're limited in how much you can contribute. And then after a certain income level, you're completely prohibited from contributing. Now, there is a caveat to that with the Roth IRA called a backdoor Roth IRA contribution. We don't have time to get into that today, but if anyone has questions or wants to discuss that loophole, shoot me an email or we can talk about it at the end of the call today. And some other accounts that I didn't mention on this slide, you could do a regular non-qualified brokerage account. So let's say you fully funded these types of accounts, or maybe you want a little more flexibility. You don't want things tied up in a retirement account. That they do have certain withdrawal restrictions and things, and early withdrawal penalties. So if you want to have a little more flexibility, you can use a non-qualified brokerage account. Buy and sell any type of investment security you want within that, but it's not going to have that tax deferred benefit like these accounts do. You would be paying tax on dividends and interest in the year that they were earned, capital gains if you sell a position for a gain. There's also an account, again, that I don't have listed here, called a health savings account. So if you end up with a high deductible health insurance plan, you may have access to what we call an HSA, health savings account. You can contribute to this, and it's actually triple tax advantaged. So you can add pre-tax dollars to it. Those dollars will grow tax deferred. And if you use them for qualified healthcare related expenses, those withdrawals will be tax free. So you're never paying tax on that money, which is a great benefit. They're also not use it or lose it. So if you put money into an HSA, and let's say you're 65 years old and you've still got a balance there and you don't need it for healthcare needs, at that point, you can actually withdraw capital from it and just pay ordinary income tax on the withdrawals like you would with an IRA. So it can be a really lucrative saving strategy too. There are other types of retirement plans as well. We just don't have time to get to them today, but there's things if you're a small business owner, like a SEP IRA, simple IRAs, there's solo 401ks for self-employed individuals. So lots to consider. But like I said, we've only got limited time, so I wanted to hit on the big ones for you. So one of the things I mentioned a couple times throughout today's presentation is the power of compounding over time and why it's so important to start saving early. Compounding is basically the investments earnings that you make are then generating their own earnings and so on. And this is a good example of that. So this is showing that if you were to grow assets at 7% per year and you were to save $5,000 every year, after 5 years, that would grow to about $28,754. So not too bad. 5 times 5 is 25,000. So you got a little bit of return there, not too shabby. After 25 years, though, that compounding effect got you to $316,000 with just $5,000 a year in savings. And after 35 years, almost $700,000. So you can see the longer you can get that money invested, even if it's a small amount of investment working for you, you can end up with a lot of money. And that's how we get to replacing that 80% of our pre-retirement income. But savings can only get you so far. So we want to be careful when it comes to saving that we're not just putting all of our retirement capital into a cash equivalent like a money market or a high yield savings account. We want to make sure that if it's a long-term capital that's to be used for retirement, that we're investing that. And the reason for that is inflation starts to eat into our purchasing power on some of our savings that aren't able to earn as robust of a return as our investments might. To give you an example of that, this gives you a nice indication of the impact of inflation over time. So if I put in $100 into a bank account deposit and I have a savings account that's earning only a 1% interest rate, so a modest savings account, which was not atypical until very recently when we've had elevated interest rates. After 1 year, I would have had $101. So I made $1 on my 1% interest. But this is 2023 in this example, okay? And we've got 6% inflation. So that 101 that grew at 1% actually lost 5% because the purchasing power has been reduced by inflation. So my $101 can only buy me $94.94 worth of stuff because of the inflation aspect, okay? So that's why we want to make sure it's okay if our savings are in that boat for our near-term immediate needs, but for our long-term investment needs for retirement, we need to make sure we're earning at least enough to cover inflation and well beyond that if possible. So a couple quick stats on the stock market in general and why it can be a good long-term investment strategy to put your capital there. This chart is looking at the performance of the S&P 500 over a number of periods since 1945. And the S&P 500 is basically an index that looks at the 500 top US companies. It's a very common benchmark that we look at when we're comparing the performance of our various different funds. So if you were to look over the last 10 years, or all of the 10-year periods, excuse me, since 1945. So every 10-year periods from 1945 to now, the S&P 500 has been positive in 97% of all of those 10-year periods. That's what this red bar represents. So 97% of those periods, it's been positive. Over 20 years, so every 20-year time frame since 1945, the S&P has been positive 100% of the time. So past doesn't guarantee future results, and we certainly always are going to see volatility in the market, but the longer the time frame, the higher the likelihood you have a probability of a gain in the stock market. When you look at the shorter time frames, you can see significantly more volatility, right? There's a higher probability of a loss. Still a higher probability of a gain than a loss, but the probability of loss is much more heightened than it is over the longer term time frames. That said, we typically only want to utilize stocks for long-term investing. Another quick stat on the stock market in general, to be honest, it's been one of the greatest money makers of all time. If you look back from 1925 through the end of 2023, if you were to have invested $1, it would be worth $12,596 in 2023. The average annual growth rate of US large cap stocks has been about 10.2% per year. That's a stellar growth rate. But again, it doesn't come without some volatility and some bumps along the road. Okay, we've certainly seen down markets throughout that time frame. So let's talk about some different asset classes, as well as some mutual funds and ETFs. So I want to go through this pretty quickly because we do have this limited time, and I want to make sure you guys have time for questions. But the main types of asset classes are going to be your stocks, also known as equities, bonds, also known as fixed income, and we have cash or cash equivalents, which we spoke about those earlier. So I won't spend time on this slide talking about those. We'll focus on stocks and bonds. So with stocks, this essentially is ownership in a company or corporation. So when you buy a stock, you become a shareholder in that company. Okay. And if that stock does well, you'll see the value of your stock position go up. If it does poorly, it'll go down. Okay. Historically, stocks have risen in value more than bonds or cash, but they also carry more risk that they may potentially decrease in value. Hence why we prefer those for those longer term investments, because they're going to have more volatile swings because they're riskier. There's a lot of different types of stocks that you can consider. So one of the things we look at when we talk about stocks is what is their market capitalization? So how big is this stock? That can be split off into large cap stocks, mid cap stocks, and small cap. So large cap, think companies you know quite well. These are big players: Apple, Amazon, Home Depot, major players. You've seen their marquee, you've heard of them, right? They've got big balance sheets, a lot of cash. They're more mature companies and inherently a little bit safer, still risky because they're stocks, but a little bit safer than their smaller counterparts, which are the mid and small caps. Mid caps, these are companies you might have heard of from time to time, maybe not. Dick's Sporting Goods is a good example of a mid-cap stock. They want to be the large caps, but they're not quite there yet. They don't have quite the balance sheet, quite the profitability, and they probably have a little more debt on their books. In your small caps, going to be riskier than both the mid and the large caps. Probably never heard of most of the companies that fall under the small cap realm, maybe some of them, but they're typically more highly levered, meaning they have more significant debt. Smaller profit margins if they're profitable at all, but they may have the potential for substantial growth over time. There's going to be kind of this risk-reward relationship when you're investing capital, and you want to keep that in mind. The more risk you take, the more potential for a more significant return, but also the more potential for significant drop. So you just want to be cognizant of that. There are also domestic stocks, so US-based stocks, international, emerging markets, global, which has a blend of US and international. There's various different sectors, so from healthcare to financials, industrials, tech, consumer staples, consumer discretionary, communications, utilities, materials. There's a wide range of different types of sectors within the market, and it's important to have diversification across those various sectors and asset classes and market caps, which we'll talk about diversification here shortly. And there's also growth versus value positions. Okay, so a lot of different things to choose from, which can make it a little bit tricky to do individual stock picking. Bonds, on the other hand, they get a lot less attention than stocks. They're just not as sexy and fun to talk about, but bonds are basically a loan to a government entity or company. So basically, it's like an IOU between the lender and the borrower. They can be issued by a corporation. So think of like a Google. They might issue a bond to raise money, or a government entity like let's say the city of San Francisco, is aimed at raising money to fund a bridge or do some road maintenance. They might issue a bond to raise money for that. So you as the borrower would say, or you as the lender, excuse me, would lend them money. Okay. They would then take that money and promise to pay you back a certain amount of interest, usually semi-annual, and they call that interest your coupon. Then at the end of the bond's term, which could be a short-term maturity, it could be intermediate term maturity or longer term, and the risk level adjusts based on the maturity. The longer the maturity of a bond, the more risk that it entails. But at the end of that bond's term, they would pay you back the full principal amount of that bond. So that initial contribution you put in, you're getting all that back plus interest along the way. And if you would have bought that bond at a discount, for example, at the front end, you would also get some appreciation because you're still getting that face value, that principal amount of that bond back in full, even if you paid a little bit of a discount rate for it on the front end. So bonds typically are going to grow in value faster than inflation and better than your cash equivalents, but typically lower returns in stocks because they're lower risk than stocks. Again, comes back down to that risk reward relationship. And just like there's different types of stocks, there are different type of bonds. So there's investment grade bonds. These are going to be your higher credit quality positions, more likely to pay their debts. You've got your municipal bonds. These are typically going to be issued by different government agencies or municipalities. Their interest will be exempt from federal income tax, and some state issued bonds will also exempt their interest from state income tax. So that can be really beneficial if you're in a higher income tax bracket to have those as part of your portfolio. There's also junk and high yield bonds. As their name entails, they're going to be more likely to default, hence why they're called junk bonds. So they may generate higher returns, but you've got to be more careful because they could potentially default and you don't get that money back. And then there's treasury notes and bonds that are issued by the US government, typically much lower risk. And a note versus a bond is just based on the maturity. So lots of different options there. And as I mentioned, cash and cash equivalents we discussed already. So moving on, I mentioned diversification. And basically what that means is not putting all your eggs in one basket. And it's really important when you're structuring out a retirement portfolio that you do diversify your holdings. And that means basically having some exposure to different asset classes, sectors, stocks, bonds, cash. You want to make sure you have a nice mixture. And what this chart is showing you is each of the different color boxes is representing a different asset class. And it's showing you from 2000 to 2023 what the highest and lowest returning asset classes were from top to bottom. So you can see in some years, the highest returning class was close to the bottom of the lowest returning class the following year. So if you had all your eggs in one basket, you wouldn't have been feeling too good the following year, right? So ideally, we want to be like those orange boxes that have the bold border. We want to start with those represent a 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio. So well diversified across stocks and bonds. And they're also representing a diversified mixture within those two asset classes. You're not at the top, you're not at the bottom, but you're right in that middle line. You're mitigating some of that volatility and some of that risk, and you end with about a 5% returns. You're kind of smack dab in the middle, okay? But you avoided a lot of volatility along the way. So two investment products that can be really helpful with that diversification aspect, so you don't have to do individual stock and bond picking, are mutual funds and exchange traded funds. These are both used with a similar goal of diversifying your assets, but they've got a couple key differences. So I'll spend some time talking about those. Let's start with mutual funds. So mutual funds can be offered on the stock side, on the bond side. There can be various different types trying to achieve a particular objective on the investment side. So essentially what happens is you give your money by buying a mutual fund position. You buy one mutual fund holding, and someone else does, and someone else does, and all this money gets pulled into that same mutual fund. And then you have a portfolio manager who actually is buying and selling a bunch of individual positions that mutual fund holds. Okay. And that portfolio manager is actively managing those underlying holdings by buying and selling to try to achieve a particular investment objective. So let's say you have a large cap growth mutual fund. The goal of that is to buy large cap, so big market cap size companies on the growth side. So think like NVIDIA, Apple, Microsoft, those type of organizations. You're going to have a basket of those underlying holdings owned within that large cap growth mutual fund that a portfolio manager is buying and selling on a regular basis to hopefully beat the market. Because mutual funds are actively managed, they cost a little bit more to handle, so they tend to have slightly higher fees and expenses than their counterpart, the exchange traded fund. And mutual funds are typically what you're going to see in your 401k, 403b plans. The exchange traded fund on the other side is passively managed. So what the investment manager is trying to do here is match a particular benchmark, match a particular index. Okay, so let's say they're trying to match the S&P 500 index. That portfolio manager says, okay, the underlying holdings of my exchange traded fund are all going to be the same as the S&P 500. That's a much lower cost to manage, right? So their internal expense ratio, or the fee associated with that fund, is going to be lower than what it would be with a mutual fund. And there can be a place for both passive and active management within your portfolio. Okay, but again, both good for diversifying. Your time horizon matters as well. So if you have got a right now goal, that should be in your cash or cash equivalent bucket. We don't want to take too much risk with assets that we need right now. Your short-term goal, if we're looking 1 to 3 years out, maybe we're using some laddered CDs, maybe we're using some treasury bills, maybe even some shorter-term bond funds, little less volatility, but we're probably not getting into equities on the short-term side. And then our long-term goals, this is where we're dealing with that real portfolio management. This is where we're going to have stocks, bonds, a mixture of other assets, okay, and can take a little more risk. So one key tip, you want to make sure you stay invested. Don't let your emotions drive your decision making. This is going to give you an example of 3 different investors who made 3 different decisions during the financial crisis back in 2008. Okay. Dylan's our first investor. He started with $100,000 in 2007, decided in March of 2009 he couldn't take it. The market was too much for him. He pulled his money out. He was going to get back in, but he ultimately never did, kept his money in cash. By April of 2023, he had only $53,500. So he locked in a loss and never regained it. Mary, second person here, she had $100,000 to start as well in the market. She only pulled out for a year. So in March of 2009, she said, I'm taking my money out, but she got back in a year later. But she missed out on a 50% plus rally in that 1 year that she pulled her money out. So ended up with about 240 grand. And Sue, she stayed invested in the market throughout April of 2023. She never got out. She ended up with almost 370 grand. So you can see, if you let your emotions drive your decisions and then you try to time your way back into the market, it can either be impossible to do. You never felt comfortable to get back in like Dylan, or you waited a little too long like Mary and you gave up significant return, or you did what Sue did and you made the best decision. You also want to make sure that you're automating your investing if you can. And a good strategy, as opposed to trying to time the market and decide when you're going to put money in versus when you're going to take money out, that can be extremely difficult. Anyone who tells you that they're a pro at timing the market is lying to you. It's not an easy task by any stretch. And if it were, I wouldn't be doing this job right now because I'd be out timing the market and you guys wouldn't need my help. Okay. So on that front, what we want to pursue is something called a dollar cost averaging strategy. Takes the emotions out of the investing, takes the timing the market out of the equation. You put in a set dollar amount at a set interval, and you're going to end up with a better average price over time. Okay. So in this scenario, we're putting in $100 each month. We're not worrying or letting our emotions drive when we put that money to work. So that pretty much sums it up, guys. I know I went a tidbit over, so I want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to leave my email up here if anybody wants to shoot me an email with questions, since I know I went over the time frame, but I'm happy to address anything that you guys have now.
Okay, and also the chat box, people have it, and there's also a survey to link there themselves, but this is exceedingly valuable. I can tell you that I had some very good advice early on and saw colleagues who didn't heed some of this advice. But that long-term piece is very, very important, and making decisions now is really critical to your future. And I think the graphs you put up there were very, very, very front. Oh, here's a question we had here. It's about some terminology you mentioned. 80% related to increase care quality of life expenditures for older population, and mentioned 401k, 403b, are the interchangeable terminology. So
401k and 403b, are they interchangeable?
yeah, yes, 403b versus 401k.
Yes, yeah. So 401k and 403b are essentially the same. A 401k is issued by a for-profit organization. A 403b is issued by a nonprofit or a government entity. So a hospital oftentimes is nonprofit. You're usually going to see a 403b type plan, but for your purposes as an investor, typically not much difference. Sometimes 403bs will allow for amplified savings after you've been there for a certain number of years, but that's all very plan specific.
Oh. It's not a very specific question. It was any general thoughts on deferring salary for income through distribution, the S Corp LLC instead?
So can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, any general thoughts on deferring a salary for income through distribution via an S Corp or LLC instead?
Yeah. So sometimes if you are self-employed or if you're a small business and you structure yourself as an S Corp, you can change how you claim your income. So you can do some of it where it's actual like W-2 style income, you're getting that paycheck, but some of it can be an income distribution from the business, which can help to keep your taxable income lower. It also can open up other types of savings vehicles that you can use. So for that person, whoever asked that question, that's a great question. There's other types of saving vehicles that you can utilize for that. If you want to shoot me an email, we can talk offline about some options for how that would work.
I think when the students said, gee, this is fantastic, could you share some of the presentation with us and let us know? So obviously people really appreciated it quite a bit.
Good. I'm so glad. And yeah, I believe this is going to be posted. It was recorded, so if anyone wants to rewatch it, revisit anything, and have access to the presentation, that will be posted for sure.
Sounds good. See if there's any other questions. I'm going through here. Oh, here's another one here. Keep up the questions. You got them thinking. This is great. How do you feel? Let me see if I can get this one. See, this one here is how. 1 sec, trying to.
Sure.
How do you feel about, let's see, how do you feel about fire? FIRE, is that available?
Fire. I don't know if I'm familiar.
So I can get something like this.
I'm assuming that's an acronym for something, but on the top of my head, I'm not thinking of what
Fire
it.
movement financial.
Financial independence, retire early. And I was just asking if you were thinking if it's actually attainable.
I don't have. So financial independent, retire early. Are you just referring to trying to retire?
It's a savings maximization strategy. And the idea is to retire early, like say before the age of 50.
Okay. Well, I think it all depends on your lifestyle, right? And at your budget. So if you're able to take enough of your after-tax income and allocate that to savings, and I run a lot of financial plans for individuals to kind of illustrate this for them, to show if you can do X amount of savings, that would allow you to meet your goal of retiring at 50, let's say. It's all about that. It doesn't really matter how much you earn. It doesn't really matter, the only thing that really matters in that scenario is how much you have the ability to save and invest. If you can invest it, grow it at a healthy growth rate, you can save enough, and it matches your particular lifestyle come age 50 or whenever that may be, then absolutely it can be obtainable. It just takes a lot of discipline and a lot of savings.
There are actually support groups across the nation actually that subscribe to this theory. And you could probably check online. They meet very regularly to dole out advice as to how to approach this particular concept. And you don't have to be a millionaire to do this, as you just stated. Actually, it could be any income level.
Yeah, it's not so much about your income. It's all about that discipline to save and what your lifestyle is come retirement. So if you have a really robust lifestyle and you want to spend, north of six figures, well into six figures come retirement, that takes a lot more savings to get there. So it can be a little bit more difficult to obtain if that's the case. But if you have a modest lifestyle, it really can be achievable, even if your income's not that high.
I think that's good. And maybe that's like compounding. I know some data showed that top 10 specialties or careers that people became millionaires, physicians weren't in the top 5. Teachers were number 3. And it was based upon, I think, that consecutive saving over time themselves. So a lesson to all of us here. So
Absolutely.
that's great. Good. That's a level. Thank you so much. I think this has been great, and we really appreciate the information you've shared with us today, and appreciate Lending Hearts. And again, folks, there is a survey in there, so if you're kind enough to do that, we do appreciate it. So it's great.
Thank you all so much for having me.
That's great. Thank you, and thank you so much. It was great.
All right, no problem.